Fukushima Daiichi is a focus on establishing an acceptable basis for a fully functioning society in all the affected areas, including revitalization of all contaminated areas, including the SDA 1, 2 and 3, the special designated areas. So recovering the evacuated areas. So the subsidiary objectives underneath the major goals of recovery are different after the accidents. The food standard limits. This is the food standard limits and the dates implemented. So this is the first 5 years of Chernobyl, and this is the period of Fukushima. So this is the estimated annual effective dose that was relevant. So less than 50, less than 8, less than 5 by 1991. Whereas in here it's less than 5 and then less than 1 when the levels went down on the 1st of April 2012. So you can see that if we make a comparison between 1991 and the 2011, the levels here for most things apart from bread and the lower level for the dairy products are higher here than they are for Fukushima, and slightly higher here for milk than in Fukushima. And after that, when the USSR split, we had different levels from Ukraine and Russia and Belarus. So you have different levels decided by the national governments after that. So in order to remediate, we need to know where we need to remediate. So we have to decide where we're going to make these actions to remediate. So you have to define that. And it's not very easy to measure dose for people. You can't just say, or look at you and say, okay, your dose is 1 millisievert. I can't just look at someone and say what the dose is, or even measure something easily to say what your dose is. So we need derived values to do that. So for the external dose, we have the ambient gamma dose rates in microsievert per hour, and for ingested dose, we have the deposited activity per unit area, normally as becquerels per meter square, or it can be becquerels per kilogram if you use the bulk density. And these are derived using models and assumption about living habits and environmental behaviour of radionuclides, which is back to what I said right at the start. It's really important to know about that so that you can derive these values in as good way as you can, as transparent a way as you can, using the best data you have to hand. If we look at the radiological criteria, we have this long-term goal for both countries of an effective annual dose of 1 millisievert. In the former Soviet Union, the USSR, in 1986 it was 100 millisievert, was the temporary permissible level for effective annual dose. 1987 it went down to 30, 1988 to 89 it went down to 25, and then from 1991 it was 1 millisievert. So there was a rapid decline not rapid. There was a decline over the 5-year period in the dose rate to which was the temporary permissible level. Whereas at Fukushima we had only one reduction to 1 millisievert from the initial 5 millisievert, which was already in Japanese legislation prior to the accident. The ambient dose rate used as a reference level was 2.2 microsieverts per hour, which corresponded to a lifetime additional dose of 350 millisieverts applied in 1989. So the USSR had a different approach to this, that it looked at the lifetime dose initially. It changed this thereafter, but initially on the lifetime additional dose of 350 millisieverts. Whereas here we have a value of 0.23, which is based on 0.19 plus 0.04 natural background, which was expected to correspond to an annual additional dose of 1 millisievert. So that 0.23, using some quite conservative calculations, was expected to correspond to 1 millisievert. I've talked about the food standard limits already. In Chernobyl, the remediated areas, the areas that needed to be remediated, were defined based on the kilobecquerels per meter square. But what is important about them is that the bands set took account of the soil type. So you needed remediation at a lower level if the soils were what we call radioecologically sensitive soils, where the cesium uptake was relatively higher. And then you needed remediation for a higher level with the less sensitive soils. So this takes account of the behavior of radiocesium, and is helpful because it means you direct resources to where they're most needed. So you don't remediate land if it's not necessary. And full-scale remediation, which would be all this radical intervention that was developed during the Kustim accident, where you did everything you could do to improve the quality of the land and the fertilizer status. But over 1480 there was no economic activity, so basically not possible to do agriculture in those areas. But the definition of contaminated land was set at 37 kilobecquerels per meter square, which identifies settlements where we could expect the annual dose rate to be 1 millisievert. For Fukushima, we have the special decontamination area and the intensive contamination survey area, which is the not evacuated areas, and the SDA is the evacuated areas, and a progression of remediating from there outwards in. So SDA 1 is the green area with different additional exposure rates and evacuation orders in place depending on the contamination level. For the ICSA, the initial definition was areas where there was possibly an additional exposure rate higher than 1 millisievert per year in the initial definition. If we compare the approaches, in both countries we had restrictions on food monitoring. The criteria were based on food standards, radiocesium in the soil and the ambient dose rate, and there was decontamination of residential areas in both countries. But the key focus at Chernobyl was external and internal dose, where the key focus of resources at Fukushima is on external dose. Doesn't mean to say there isn't some application and intention for internal dose, but most resources are focused on external dose reduction. Remediated areas, here are all settlements with an average individual dose exceeding 1 millisievert, whereas here is the ICSA and evacuated areas SD 1, 2 and 3, so it includes evacuated areas. The approach is fundamentally different. The approach in Chernobyl was risk-based and was focused on averted dose. So how much dose do you stop by doing the remediation? So the focus was, how much dose can you avert by doing the various actions that you're going to do? And you optimize, and Gerhard talked about optimization earlier. When you optimize, you take into account the cost of doing that optimization. So averted dose and cost-benefit analysis were important components of the strategy. Whereas here, the focus was on rapid implementation. Do it fast. Optimize, but taking account in an early stage on the social and cultural influence. And the other thing was that a cost-benefit analysis was not the most important factor, and that you have sufficient financial resources available such that cost was not a key factor in the optimization process. And a high priority was on dose reduction, even in the less affected areas in the ICSA, where you have this reduction, fast reduction in dying because of the ratio of 1:1 with 134. So that difference, if you compare the approach of Chernobyl with that at Fukushima Daiichi, and if you had used some of the elements that were used in the Chernobyl, it's not necessarily the case that the ICSA areas would have been remediated at all in using elements of the Chernobyl approach. If we look at the cost, it certainly was high, especially for a relatively poor country after Chernobyl. But it was very high after the Fukushima Daiichi accident because of this lower emphasis, if any, on cost for the first 5 years. In the forest, there was optimization and there was advice given at local level to residents about what was safe to collect, what was not safe to collect, and local monitoring availability. In Fukushima Daiichi, one thing that was done was this border decontamination of forests. And I think this is a classic example of a remediation option that is largely taking place because of social and cultural concern. The actual effectiveness in reducing ambient dose rate is very low. So the option, if you talk about averted dose in the Chernobyl approach, it would not be prioritized. And it was prioritized in Japan because of the social concern, probably also possibly connected to the fact that people are going back to evacuated areas and they don't want contaminated forests near their houses, etc. So again, it's to do with the approach and the goal eventually. So the effectiveness of decontamination, the topsoil removal did happen at Chernobyl, but largely in residential areas, not in agricultural land. Fukushima Daiichi, there was some removal of topsoil in agricultural land, but not so much nowadays at the moment. The effectiveness of reduction was about the same for both countries, for the different methods used. And we can see here that the range of remediation measures that were used after Fukushima Daiichi is more extensive than that used at Chernobyl, where the decontamination in the first 5 years of the rural settlements was carried out by troops, army. And here you did a farmland pilot project, based on information, of course, about what happened at Chernobyl, of these different methods to remove topsoil that you carried out in the first year to make sure that they would work for Japanese systems. If we compare the agricultural remediation monitoring, you have the reverse, that we have a very extensive remediation for animals, for instance, where there's just a little bit of clean feeding at Fukushima, but more extensive use of these measures, and about the development of new measures around Fukushima connected with rice, which has never been a problem before. So development of new methods. Clean feeding became very important with the live monitoring after Chernobyl, and radical improvement binders, whereas here it's looking in particular at the rice system, deep ploughing and treatment with extra potassium, which are the fundamental remediation options used for the crops. And again, we have contamination level based remediation measures, so more measures used as you go higher up the contamination level in the soil. So similar approach there in some ways. For forest remediation, I've already mentioned this, but there are some new things at Fukushima, like an action level for wood for production of mushroom, and this decision not to implement additional measures in forest at the minute. I think that's an important decision to make, at the moment for Fukushima Daiichi. And in Chernobyl, you have a lot of information given to local people about what to do and when, and advice centres where people can go to get information, even about the contamination level in different types of mushroom and how it's changing. Waste is a big difference. At Chernobyl, we have decontamination of about 1,000 settlements, and the waste was buried nearby. But the remediation options that were used at Chernobyl were deliberately selected to not generate large amounts of waste. You could say Fukushima didn't follow that policy, putting it mildly. And of course, we have the decontamination of the ICSA and the SDA, and this huge generation of waste and very high associated costs, and a legacy which needs to be dealt with. So to conclude, for both accidents, we have this long-term goal of remediation of an individual annual effective dose of 1 millisievert. But the radiological consequences of the Fukushima Daiichi accident for the public is much lower than that for Chernobyl, for reasons which I hope we've explained. But the scale of remediation is comparable. It's similar. This is because the radiological criteria for remediation applied in Japan are lower than those applied in the USSR, and so they have relatively higher associated costs. And the adoption of lower food standards and remediation action levels in Japan, because this degree of conservatism, partly due to the lack of prior experience, whereas at Chernobyl, people came in from Kushtim and knew about setting levels immediately and what the numbers would be or might be for setting those levels. And the decision to remediate evacuated land in Japan. So after Chernobyl, we have this weighting averted doses versus cost, and it was a very important part of the remediation strategy in the first 5 years. Whereas in Japan, remediation of these affected areas was justified and implemented not only on radiological criteria, but also on social and cultural considerations. And that's the reason why the actual levels of remediation activities are comparable, similar.